I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Carrion. He is a professor from the area of child and adolescent psychiatry, and he's from Stanford University. Dr. Carrion examines the interplay between brain development and stress vulnerability via a multi-method approach that includes psychophysiology, neuroimaging, neuroendocrinology, and phenomenology. Dr. Carrion is also involved in treatment development that focuses on individual and community-based interventions for stress-related conditions in children and adolescents that experience traumatic stress. In his talk, Dr. Carrion will describe stress from a developmental perspective. So please
Yes, thank
take
you.
the
Thank you
stage.
so much. Thank you for inviting me. Lunch is one of those things that is supposed to increase cortisol. So supposedly you should all be a little bit more alert after lunch, but I kind of don't feel that way sometimes. I feel like I get sleepy after lunch. I want to thank you for the invitation here. It's a pleasure to be here for the first time, and I look forward to share this conversation with you. What I have planned for today is really talk about the conceptualization of traumatic stress, because as you can see from the day, all these terms are out there, and it's very important that we understand what we anchor our nomenclature in. Knowing that there were many limitations about that, one of the reasons we started this program was because we wanted to identify biological markers that could help us understand PTSD better during development. And when I say development, I would like for you to think about two things: development of humans, right, as we are children and we grow into adults, but also the PTSD itself, because the PTSD, or the post-traumatic stress disorder, is also developing as an individual ages, or as the PTSD has been there longer. Meaning that this whole idea of what is cortisol high or low, or is this structure small or big, is it functioning more, it might be different at different times, not only according to the age of the individual, but also according to the age of the allostatic load, if you will. Then we use this information that basically tells us these children have problems with executive function and emotion regulation to develop treatment interventions. And the idea of identifying biological markers is not only so that we can understand the condition better, but it's also so that we can put some of our treatments to the test. So for example, if we find increased pre-bedtime cortisol to be elevated in a subset of kids, can this intervention actually decrease that level of cortisol? So that required that we develop a treatment intervention and also work with some that are existent. I am going to talk about our method here, which is called the Q-centered treatment protocol, and if we have time, I'm going to present a case as well treated with that intervention. And then here, what it was all about, the whole thing is really so that we can do treatment outcome research and see if we can increase the empirical evidence that we have for these treatments. I'm going to talk about two studies, hopefully, that we are currently conducting, one on yoga and mindfulness, and one a treatment trial that involves CCT and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is another treatment modality for children that experience trauma. Yes, like Joseph said, the whole battle between nature and nurture is pretty much over, and that's a good thing. It requires both of these elements to combine and be together, and that alters our level of stress vulnerability. So hopefully what we're learning today is that there's really a subjective part of this and an objective part of this, and part of that objectivity is where we each are in our level of how much stress we can tolerate. And that may be also different at different stages of our life, and that also may change epigenetically through the methylation process that Joseph was talking to us about. And what we see is that may result in a number of outcomes. One, resilience, which by the way is a very poor term because we don't know what it means. I invite you to reconsider adaptation. It may be a better term. The problem that I have with resilience is that if we put the threshold of symptoms or pathology at this level, and some individuals are under that level. We're calling all of those individuals resilient. But there may be some individuals that are here and truly do not move. Those are what would be the truly resilient. But those that are accumulating their allostatic load event by event and have not reached that threshold level, they look just like the others. So we're calling all of them resilient, when in fact they all might not be. Then I use post-traumatic stress disorder with a lot of caveats, and I will be mentioning that throughout the talk because I think it has helped identify some children, and now in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Psychiatry Disorders number 5, it's a little bit better at incorporating developmental modifications. But there will be 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. So we still don't know if we are capturing everything. It's a very heterogeneous group, which is also something else that we are going to talk about. Eventually, what I think is that we will finish with a DSM that talks about brain networks, and that will say in this condition we see brain network 14, 36, and 5 altered. In this other condition, we see 68 and 5, and that explains some symptom overlap. And then there's a lot of comorbidity between anxiety and depression and PTSD as well. You've seen this before from Carrion. I like this slide, but here what we have is the inverted U-curve shape, meaning that some level of stress inoculation is good, and we need it. We need it during development. We need it to develop our immunological system. If we don't care about that exam that we have tomorrow, we'll probably fail. So our performance will be very low because our stress level was very low. So it's good for us to be stressed. We don't want to be hit by cars and things like that, up to an optimal point. After that optimal point, then we see the performance change, and the happiness and the health. And like Karen described, this is the area that we are talking about today. This is the area that I refer to as traumatic stress. And specifically, objectively, this can be natural catastrophes as well as man-made catastrophes. So these are Australian bushfires. This is a 4-year-old depicting her experience in Haiti after the earthquake. So we did a physical exam and a mental status exam, and she looked perfectly healthy, perfectly normal. But at the moment that she could grab a crayon and a piece of paper, she started depicting her narrative, her story. And her story was that she and her sister were the only survivors of their household, and that she was now staying with the neighbors. So the individuals that came with her, that brought her to the clinic, were actually the neighbors. So even though she looked okay in the whole other medical context, there is something that she needed to process, right? It's starting to accumulate her allostatic load. Of course, we have man-made catastrophes besides nature catastrophes, and events like Hurricane Katrina that combine both. Not only here we saw the events of the hurricane, but there was a lot of separation and loss between families after this. They wanted to protect the children, and they removed them from their caretakers, which is probably the worst thing that you can do to a very young kid after a catastrophe like this. And the issue that I'm going to talk about today, when I talk about kids and the results of our studies, we're really talking about children that experience interpersonal violence. And that's defined as physical abuse, sexual abuse, and or witnessing violence, like domestic violence or community violence. And not only that, but the literature also refers to some children that grow up in areas where there's a lot of war as being indirectly exposed, which I don't think is a good term because their exposure is not that indirect. In fact, here you can see this is from a movie called The Interrupters. I think it was called The Interrupters. These are adults that as young kids were part of gangs in Chicago. And now what they used to do was every time one of their friends would die, they would write the name of the kid that died as a consequence of violence. And here you can see that it says, I am next. So this is someone who, has not gone through that experience, but has been witnessing the violence and have the same fear and threat mechanism that he or she might be next. And interestingly enough, everything that we're talking today about when a threat happens or when a trauma happens, those mechanisms that get activated are the same mechanisms that get activated with the possibility of something happening. So, kids that live in war areas, for example. So I'm going to give you the example of Sammy. Sammy is an 11-year-old boy who was brought to our clinic because of increased aggression towards his siblings. Mom reported that this was very uncharacteristic of Sammy's previous demeanor. She also reported decreased academic performance. Feeling guilty and confused, she reported to the authorities that Sammy's father had regularly abused her and the children physically and emotionally for a number of years. Sammy had been hit numerous times with metal bars, wooden rods, and bamboo sticks. Sammy's mother felt the boy's behavior was directed at her for breaking the family up. Mom and kids were now living in a new apartment after the father had been arrested and deported. Sammy had nightmares and difficulty sleeping, and not surprisingly had symptoms of PTSD as well. So I'm going to go back to Sammy after I present to you some of the data and some of the development of our treatment. I'll tell you right away though, I'm going to present a lot of very sexy stuff, structural MRI, functional MRI, levels of cortisol. To this day, nothing has been a stronger predictor of children developing PTSD than the behavior of guilt. So guilt is a very good predictor of PTSD. So if we can actually work with guilt even before we see the PTSD, we could really prevent not only the development of PTSD, but the development of anxiety disorders that are comorbid with PTSD. You can also see here that that trauma is complicated. You read this and you're thinking, well, this is a child that experienced physical abuse, but it's more than that, right? It's also a child that lost his dad. So the dad has been deported. So like he said himself, not every day was bad. Some days we would go for ice cream, or some days we would go to the park, and those days are gone too. So it gets complicated. So what happens to the brain while the brain is developing and experiencing the types of events that I'm describing? Specifically, what happens to the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the development of executive function and which is not fully developed when we are born. It continues to develop up to our mid-20s or late 20s and maybe even later. What happens to areas like the amygdala, which were presented previously, and areas like the hippocampus, where we encode and retrieve memories of events, and these limbic areas or subcortical areas work in close connection with these cortical regions. There's a lot of back and forth happening, but like Joseph said earlier, some of these structures have a lot of receptors for cortisol. And cortisol has been shown in preclinical or animal research to be neurotoxic when present in high amounts. It actually can kill cells in the hippocampus, for example, and this is work by Bruce McEwen, who came up with that term of allostatic load, and also one of his students, Robert Sapolsky, who's in the biology department at Stanford. So what we wanted to do was take these principles and adapt them to humans and see what the humans would show, both in terms of cortisol and also imaging. So, in a way, in the same way that we regulate temperature with our homeostatic process, we can also regulate stress. And we really have the capacity to manage tremendous amount of stress. But you have to put that in a balance. You have to see how much stress it is, what are your coping mechanisms, what are your support mechanisms, and how much you can carry. So a child can carry a load, right? A child can carry a backpack even if they're 5, 6, or 7. But if you make that backpack really, really heavy, the little child may fall backwards. Okay, so when that happens, that's allostatic load. An allostatic load during development affects one of the main areas that children have to develop, which is play. So play becomes traumatic play, and is characterized by non-enjoyment. You can see here in the picture that there's horror in the faces of this child that was exposed to war. And it's also repetitive. There's this perseveration that it keeps happening, going on and on and on. So for example, that little girl in Haiti, if every day we came and we gave her a crayon, she might keep doing the same thing, because there's this perseveration, which also reflects that there might be something going on in the prefrontal cortex. Now, one of the early 2001 pieces of work that we did was to compare this nomenclature that we have and see how helpful it was. And what we did was we looked at function. How are the kids doing? How are they doing at school? How are they doing in terms of the distress they are experiencing? How are they doing with their families? And we realized that if you have subthreshold symptoms but not the full diagnosis, there was no difference in any of the functions between those two groups. Once again, demonstrating the limitations of a behavioral definition for PTSD. When we look at the symptoms that were more common, we found this to be the symptoms that were more common. And what's interesting about it is that usually when people think about PTSD, they think of it as an emotional disorder. But as you can see, most of the symptoms are really about processing information. So they are cognitive, not only cognitive as well, but PTSD may actually be a primary cognitive disorder, which emotional involvement, but the cognition aspect of it is important as well, telling us not only to look at the limbic system, but also look at the prefrontal cortex. So then how do we approach these areas? How do we approach cortisol? How did we approach the formation of the hippocampus and its functions? Because it's dynamic throughout development, as it is the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala. And you've heard about the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, resulting in the release of cortisol. And what the literature was demonstrating is that adults that have chronic PTSD were having low levels of cortisol, and adults that had, and this is work by Rachel Yehuda from the Bronx VA, and that adults that had acute, like a recent diagnosis of breast cancer, for example, stress, would have high levels of cortisol. So the adult literature was mixed in terms of high and low cortisol. Also, structurally, when combat veterans at the VA system were MRIs were done in their brains, we were seeing that there was a hippocampal decrease in volume in those that had PTSD. But if chronically you have low levels of cortisol, how do you explain neurotoxicity in the hippocampus, right? Because you would expect that you had high levels of cortisol throughout development, and that's what eventually caused the hippocampal damage, but that doesn't seem to be the case. To complicate matters, some people speculate that hippocampal size has nothing to do with the amount of stress that you experience, and that is actually genetic, and this is work by Gilbertson, where he looked at twins that were twins, and one was a veteran and one wasn't. And when he looked at the MRI of these twins, the MRIs were the same size, independent of if they had had stress or not. But what that paper doesn't do is that it doesn't rule out the possibility of neurotoxicity. So it might be that there's both elements, as we often see, playing a role. What did we find? by looking at school-age children between the ages of 10 and 16 and comparing them with a gender and age healthy match control. What we found was, and this was also very early, we found, first of all, you notice that normal circadian rhythmicity that we've been talking about. High at the beginning of the day to wake up and get going, and then decreasing as the day goes on. But meals, as I said, can increase our cortisol. So it was important for us to get it pre-breakfast, pre-lunch, pre-dinner, and then pre-bedtime. And what is not evident here, but what was really significant was this pre-bedtime level. This was significantly high in the kids with PTSD compared to the control group. Now, this raises the question, is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, when you have PTSD, are you supposed to have high levels of cortisol? Maybe. But it's not that clear-cut, because we know that having high levels of cortisol can also be neurotoxic, right? So then we wanted to look at the brain, but we kept looking at cortisol to see how steady this finding was. And then years later, with a bigger sample size and using more sophisticated analysis, HLM, we continue to see this increased level of pre-bedtime cortisol. Interestingly enough, this is also the time when many of these children have difficulties. They have difficulties with sleep, they have enuresis or bedwetting, they have fear of the dark, they don't sleep well, and sleep is a big area, and we'll hopefully talk about that. But we really consider pre-bedtime levels of cortisol that are elevated to be in the realm of pediatric PTSD. However, we wanted to test this theory that very much PTSD could be considered a developmental disorder, and that how do you get to those adults that Rachel Yehuda sees, right, that have low levels of cortisol? We felt that this was a very insidious, active process. And what we did was we actually took a bigger sample and divided them between kids that have had events during the past year and kids that had events longer than a year before. And our usual increased level of cortisol pre-bedtime in kids that had recent events, we found that to be the case. But in those kids that have had events for a long time, in other words, their allostatic load has been accumulating for a while, what we found was the opposite, that the cortisol level was starting to come down. So once again, dynamic system. But what happens in the meantime? What happens when you have this exposure to cortisol, if we know that cortisol can be neurotoxic? So that's when we decided to look at the brain again, especially during development, because as I mentioned, there's nothing in the literature saying that kids are resilient by virtue of just being children. It's the opposite. A lot is happening at this time. We have 100 billion neurons, trillions of synapses, pruning that may or may have not happened, and then the whole process of myelination that continues for their school-age years. So we got MRI imaging and a structural MRI machine, and then we passed it through a software process that is basically 3 steps. The first step is to get rid of everything we're not interested in, like the muscle and the bone, right? So we only have the brain, that's called skull stripping. Then we take the brain and we divide, well, not we, the software divides those images into gray matter, the cells, the neurons, the white matter, the axons, and the cerebrospinal fluid images. And then what you can do is you can superimpose a surgical map, a coordinate that actually allows for the measuring of many of the regions of interest that we are talking about. And because of all the reasons I've mentioned before, we were very interested in looking at the prefrontal cortex. And one of the findings that we had were that there were areas of the prefrontal cortex that were not growing like the rest of the prefrontal cortex, or like they were growing in the healthy controls. So we look at those areas in particular, areas like the decreased left ventral and left inferior prefrontal areas. And they actually had a negative correlation with their levels of pre-bedtime cortisol. So the higher the cortisol they had, the smaller the structures were. Now, when you do structural imaging, it's like taking a Polaroid, right? You see a picture, you see something. Do people know what Polaroid is anymore? Okay, it's just a picture, right? So it doesn't tell you much. You can interpret it in many different ways. And that's when functional imaging becomes very interesting, because it actually allows us to see what the prefrontal cortex is doing. And one task that taps at the prefrontal cortex is an executive function task. And we call this the go, no, go. And it's very simple. If you see a letter, press a button, right? Oh, but when you see the letter X, don't press. So pretty simple instruction. And you would think, oh, if a kid is very impulsive or they would not paying attention to the instructions, they may press when they see the X, right? But the reality is that behaviorally, both groups did the same, because the instructions were pretty simple. You can make this task more and more difficult. But because it was very basic, very simple, they both performed the same way, which is what we wanted. Because if you see neurofunctional differences, then you don't attribute them to them behaving differently, but you attribute them to something functionally happening that's differently. And in fact, that's what we did. That's what we found when we combine the data from the healthy controls with the data of the kids that have post-traumatic stress symptoms. Can you see the red in the back of the room? Yeah. So in here, this analysis actually superimposes the image of the healthy children on top of the children that have PTSS. And normally, to do this task of executive function, the go, no go, you would involve your superior, middle, and inferior frontal cortex, and both groups did. If we look at their, within group analysis, you will see both of them activated. But in this in-between analysis, what we find is that the control group is activating the middle frontal cortex significantly more than the kids with PTSS, suggesting that we may have a functional marker to problems of executive function in kids with PTSD, meaning decreased activation of the middle frontal cortex. But what happens though if we put the PTSD picture on top of the control group? What is the PTSD activating more? Well, then what we see here in the middle is not the middle frontal cortex, but the medial frontal cortex. And the interesting thing about the medial frontal cortex is that it's not supposed to be activated for this task at all. The medial is not involved in cognitive processing, is involved with emotional processing. Meaning that this could mean that the kids with PTSD are activating other regions in terms of as an attempt to maintain the same level of performance. It also probably means that this is due to their anxiety, right? If we take 3 individuals that had a lot of anxiety, that disappears. So what we may be seeing here is the high comorbid anxiety that we have with children with PTSD. Now, earlier I mentioned that PTSD is probably a very heterogeneous, not probably, it is a very heterogeneous group, right? So one of the things we use this methodology is to help us distinguish between groups. And here we wanted to compare those kids that involve in self-injury, like kids that dissociate, versus kids that do not have a history of self-injurious behaviors. And a very interesting structure that we're paying a lot of attention because we think it holds a lot of promise came up, and that's the insula. So the insula is a cortical region of the brain, but it's difficult to get at. It's actually very insulated. It's in the temporal side of the brain. And it receives afferent information, it receives physiological information, and it has sends out a lot of motor information as well. So it's like a hub of processing information. And if we actually look at insula activity compared with the gold standard instrument that we use to measure PTSD in children, the relationship is very significant and very strong. So we are continuing to look at the insula as a means to get a window into PTSD in children. Now, this did not work, but basically, I'll tell you what happened when we look at the hippocampus. Michael DeBellis, Duke, Martin Teicher at Harvard, and I had been looking, because of everything that I've mentioned, at the hippocampus in children with PTSD with MRI, and we have found no differences. Okay? So that's good. It might represent that there's a window of opportunity there to intervene before we have this hippocampal neurotoxicity. One thing that I did, though, is that I follow a cohort of these kids, 17 of these kids, for a year to a year and a half, and created a variable of the change in hippocampal volume from time 1 to time 2, and the pre-bedtime cortisol level actually correlated inversely with that change. So the higher the level, the more the change of cortisol, saying that probably the reason we don't see hippocampal change is because it's early on this insidious process of hippocampal damage secondary to cortisol. Once again, structural, right? So let's move to functional. And when we give a memory task in fMRI, what we see is increased activity of the hippocampus, significant increased activity in the hippocampus of normal, healthy children with no PTSD and no post-traumatic stress scores. And here we can see the voxel, the units of activation, being significantly more in the healthy controlled children than the PTSD kids. So even though it's hard to see structurally, the hippocampus is not functioning as well already. So both of the tasks that I have described are tasks that are cognitive in nature, executive function, and this task of memory. Now I'm going to present one about emotion, and that's the faces, and many of you are maybe familiar with this task, but children are exposed to different faces, and you see what the brain does when they're exposed to these reactions. And one of the things that we find is a lot of the same players, a lot of the cortical, prefrontal cortical, a lot of the limbic, amygdala, and hippocampus being activated more in the PTSD group when compared to the healthy control. And specifically, when showing fearful faces, what we see is that prefrontal cortex activation doesn't happen as robustly as it happens in the healthy control. So the prefrontal cortex is supposed to work as a brake in that amygdala. Kids that have PTSD secondary to stress have an amygdala that is very active. This is how active it is. As soon as they see the picture, it becomes significantly more activated than in the healthy controls. But then they have an amygdala that's very active and a prefrontal cortex that's not working as well in terms of causing this inhibition. So this is telling us there's some frontal limbic networks that need to be enhanced when treating children with post-traumatic stress disorder. So then what we hope is that we gather more information on the susceptibility to traumatic stress and go beyond family history, gender, history of previous trauma, and look at high levels of cortisol, early amygdala reactivity, and diminished prefrontal cortex activity. Now, everything that I said sounds like bad news, right? Like, there's damage here. Well, if you think about it, the only thing I'm saying is that environment plays a role on how the brain develops. So why don't we take advantage of that and actually make the environments better in a way that it would actually maybe repair some of the changes that have happened or protect the brain from having those changes. And those regions that I've been talking about, the cortical region, excuse me, and the limbic region, They're very complex, but they're also very plastic. So that's why they become susceptible to stress and trauma, because they're very plastic. But then they may become very plastic also to the interventions that we do. So without treatment, PTSD doesn't go away. It actually becomes worse with time, and it becomes more complex. That self-injurious behavior may come, addiction may play a role, all of this sometimes as attempts to self-medicate or take care of the symptoms. Even those who recover from PTSD are increased risk of experiencing PTSD after another trauma occurs. Like we mentioned, developmental youth may be particularly vulnerable, and there's, it's something that really impacts the whole life of the child. So we need treatments, and one treatment we developed is called cue-centered therapy, and is really following its model after the Pavlovian classical conditioning theory, right? So we basically teach children classical conditioning, and they get it. They first don't understand what's happening to them, right? They hear that they're being called a problem or crazy or bad, and this is what they hear at school, at home. As soon as they and their parents understand that there's a reason why the body is reacting, like if they were in a threatening situation, when in fact they are not in a threatening situation anymore, they understand. To give you an example, a child in a classroom hears a loud noise, right? There's loud noises in classrooms all the time. And he just runs out of the classroom and leaves the school, right? There's no context for the teacher or the other students to place that behavior in. But if we understand that usually at home, these noises represent domestic violence, and the way that he has to protect himself is from leaving the situation, we can understand how that body learned that response for that stimulus, and that response has generalized and now gets spread, right? So this is a short treatment. It's multimodal, it's flexible, and concentrates on cognition, emotion, behavior, and physiology, because our prior research informs it. We really want to improve executive function and emotion regulation. And it reduces negative cognitions, it helps express emotion, gains empowerment. It's really increasing self-efficacy to the child. Most of these children will continue to experience traumatic events in their life. So we want them to be equipped. We just don't want them to go through a therapeutic experience. We want them to be their main agent of change and feel empowered by their knowledge. And it's happening. We did a randomized controlled trial of 56 kids, 28 kids in each condition, one being a wait list. And we saw a decrease of PTSD symptoms. We saw, when the parents scored the PTSD symptoms, also a decrease. We saw decreased anxiety symptoms. Usually at the beginning of any treatment, you would see anxiety treatments decrease, but here you can see that with the CCT, they continue to decrease. And this is how the curve looked for symptoms of PTSD. And clinically, many of you may not be in this field, but there's nothing too creative here. We do things that therapists usually do. We do exposure, we do cognitive work to increase positive thoughts, but we do that piece of education. That piece of education is very important. And here, the biggest slope in decrease of symptoms is happening when that education is happening. So if you put all therapeutic things aside and just concentrate on telling kids what's going on, that's what you see. And telling the families what's going on. So information is very important. Sometimes we're not the best informers. So we work with cues. The kids identify their own cues. They're very active during this treatment. They're not passive receivers of a therapeutic intervention, but they're active team members of this therapeutic intervention. And kids mention all of these cues are usually not negative things. They're neutral, but the associations have been negative because of the experience with the trauma. They have a toolbox where they actually write things that we teach them, like exercise breathing, muscle relaxation, mindfulness, right? And those work, but nothing works as well as if the kid develops a tool of their own and they bring it to you on the next session. So a kid came to me once and said, well, I said, do you practice all these things we taught you to handle, how to change responses? And he's like, no. But he was doing a lot better. And I asked him, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm taking a glass of milk. And at that moment, I knew I could say, no, you need to practice your exercises. Or I could make a big issue about drinking a glass of milk and put it in the toolbox, which is what I did. So kids that develop their own tools do a lot better. And they usually do a lot better with the tools that they develop. And what that means is that empowerment, that self-efficacy is therapeutic. Any behavior has 4 corners in this treatment: what we think, how our body feels, what we do, and how we feel emotionally, and this is how we feel physically. And although it's a structured treatment, it's flexible in that depending on the temperament of the child, one starts with each of these corners, and then the other corners change as well. So for example, if a kid is very brainy and wants to change negative thoughts to positive thoughts, we may start in that corner. If they like relaxation exercises, we may start in that corner. So let's go to Sammy so that you can see how the treatment actually goes. So we are ready to remind you of the case. He was demonstrating increased aggression. And this is very important. This is uncharacteristic of him, right? Because this behavior could be done due to many things, not only trauma, but the fact that it starts after trauma and the fact that it was very different from his behavior before made this association with the traumatic stress. And as you can see, it affects performance. And there's the physical abuse, but then there's the adjusting and then the loss. So the first thing we did was education into PTSD symptoms, and this helped mom become more available because for her, who also was traumatized by this domestic violence, by the way, Sammy was a cue. So our response to cues is to avoid them. So at the moment that Sammy needed her the most, she was avoiding him unconsciously, not intentionally. Once she learned this, then she didn't have to do that anymore. Sammy found that relaxation exercises were very helpful. One has to be very careful to avoid suggestion when they tell their narrative. And there we learn more about how he felt, including that feeling of guilt. By the way, mom felt very guilty as well. Sammy and his mother were introduced to the concept of traumatic cues as something that's neutral, not good or bad. His brain associated those cues to aggression, classical conditioning, and then he needed to find out what was a cue for him. And he brought to the session that when mom would get to the house, the slamming of the car door would remind him that dad was coming into the house. And he would get very hyper-aroused and he would get very tense, and he associated that with violence. So he became violent eventually. And so mom was like, oh, so let me get rid of the car. And I'm like, no, the car is not bad. The car is just the car. The car is going to help us in the treatment. The car is going to help us through exposure, right? So exposure, behavioral desensitization means that slowly first imagining, then kind of role playing, and then in vivo in the natural setting, you're exposed to these cues, and your body then becomes regulated again into accepting those and being able to perceive them as non-threatening. And we took him through that process as well. So you don't need to old cues because it's impossible to be able to identify every cue that we identify with every behavior or action, but you just need some to make a connection, and then you engage the challenges behavioral desensitization and promote self-efficacy, and he did much better after that. So this is what these kids go through. So in terms now, okay, so now we have a treatment, right? Now we understand to some degree what's happening in the brain while in development during stress. We have the opportunity now to be able to see, well, do these biological markers change with interventions? So we have two projects going on. The first one is what we call the Health and Wellness Project. And what that is 3,500 children from a school district have in their curriculum now for 3 years yoga and mindfulness. And we conducted a baseline assessment that is multi-method. So we got the cortisol, we got the MRI, and we added something new. We added sleep polysomnography. And sleep is very important. I told you that there were a lot of problems that happen at night. We always thought of those as another symptom of PTSD in children, but it may be that actually sleep problems might be primary. And if you don't have enough deep sleep, you cannot process the events of the day. And if you don't process the events of the day, what you store in your hippocampus is not a narrative of I went through X, Y, and Z and I survived it, is those cues. That's what you store. Or if you're very young and you don't have a vocabulary, that's what you store. You store the emotion, you store the cues. So we are looking at sleep polysomnography. Baseline will tell you that the MRI tasks are looking at the regions we are interested in. Sleep-wise, we were surprised by finding that 30% of this cohort, which is not a clinical cohort, it's just a school district where there's a lot of violence in the community, 30% of that cohort is experiencing apnea. So they actually spend times of the night where they are not breathing, like diagnosable apnea. Right now we're doing time 2, which is a year after. Some of that deep sleep, we can see that improving. If you say I said that, I'm going to deny it because we are still analyzing the data, but it does look promising. It does look like actually sleep is going to improve. But we're gathering time 2 data now. Then we're going to wait another 6 months, and then we're going to do the multi-method assessment again. So that's the Health and Wellness Project. In the Stanford Youth Solutions, no affiliation, this is actually a trauma clinic in another part of California. We're taking CCT treatment that I just presented, and we're taking trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and we're taking another treatment that the clinic does, meaning treatment as usual. They do whatever they feel they should be doing. And we feel like we're going to learn from the 3 of them. This is not a study to demonstrate that one is better than the other, but actually to see what types of kids are responding to what components of what treatments. So in there, what we're doing is once again gathering behavioral and academic data. And then it's going to be hard to take all these kids to the MRI. MRI is very expensive. MRI is very invasive, and we did it, and it was great, and I'll probably do it again in the future. But you cannot use it like in a school project, right? Because it requires for children to go to the MRI and things like that. By the way, sometimes people ask me, how can you get children that are typically very anxious into an MRI? I don't know how many of you have had an MRI, but they're very noisy, and you have to be still, and you have to be still for prolonged periods of time. Well, we have a mock MRI machine, and in this mock MRI, you can gauge pretty well if a child can do it or not, and it's also a process of behavioral desensitization. As they are doing it, they get more and more comfortable. In terms of their movement, they're watching a movie while they are in this mock MRI, and if they move, the movie stops. So that actually teaches them to be still if they want to do this. So, but we're not doing that. We're not doing the MRI. We're doing a new method called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. And this FNIRS, and it works really well. Oh, that's the other side, okay. Here it is. And it works really well temporally, better than MRI. You can see that what the activation happening in the brain happened at the time that you were checking on the task better than an MRI. But spatially, it's more limited. So it cannot get to the subcortical structures that we are interested in. It just looks at the cortex. It looks at the cortical part of the brain. But the reason we're doing it is because it's ambulatory. It's actually portable. And we can take it to schools, we can take it to different agencies. We have piloted this, and it has worked well for us in terms of separating children with generalized anxiety disorders from healthy children by demonstrating increased activation on the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex of children with GAD. Now, everything I've talked about, and you, I think you have a similar slide, everything that I've talked about is here. It's in the microsystem. Actually, it's the micro, right? Because we're talking about the child's brain, so it's like right there. Family, peers, all of this becomes very important. Obviously, school and community, and obviously the society in general. So the ecological socio-ecological approach to children that experience traumatic stress is key in terms of developing treatments. So I have talked a little bit about our clinical work, a little bit about our research, but we also engage in policy work across the state and also nationally in order to cause legislation that will prevent the traumas from happening in the first place. And we obviously cannot do that for every single instance, so we need to be prepared. But this is just to remind you that it's really a more complex picture than the one I presented. These are different institutions that support this work, and of course you require a team to do this, and they're all wonderful, and I thank them all. And I thank you, and I'm ready to answer any questions.
So many questions. I really liked the fact that you've got this functional output and you're working in these different youth projects, and the challenge also of having very individual stories that you're working with and treating. I was curious. First question is, you talked about the example of the display, the glass of milk solution. Was that just classical displacement or distraction technique, or was there something more to it?
No, he actually said that he did it as a coping mechanism. Right. So he said, I did it and I felt better, so then I kept doing it when I wanted to feel better. And it was going to be either my ego or his improvement. Right. No. So I went with his improvement, and it really served really well, and it became part of the actual protocol. So children are encouraged to develop their own tools.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic, because they're probably going to be more creative. No disrespect to academics, but like the kids are pretty creative. So
yeah, and faster, right, to drink a glass of milk than going through.
And my second big question is the sleep apnea. That sort of blew me away. What on earth is going on there that you have?
Well, we don't know if it's anatomical or if it's obesity, if nutrition is also a problem in that community. And so, but interestingly enough, you know, we're gonna get academic data, and part of that academic data is to measure the amount of fat that children have. Right. So we're going to be able to see if the fat changed from time 1 to time 2 while they were doing yoga, because what we're seeing is that they're taking it out of their classrooms and they're doing it after school, they're doing it at home, they're teaching others. So a subset of them may actually be losing weight, and that may help the apnea improve. Sure. But probably not all of them.
Okay, great, thank you. Brilliant, time for good questions. Thoughts?
Great.
I think everybody's happy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.